Is masculinity toxic? As a child abuse survivor in the 1960s, Nancy Pearcey fled from her father's toxic masculinity. But 50 years later, the wife and mother of two sons has concluded that our culture today is at war with the wrong enemy. In her most recent book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, Pearcey argues from academic and public social sciences data that the toxic masculinity we all despise is the product of an unholy trinity of really bad ideas like secular humanism, atheism, and, interestingly enough, nominal Christianity. Pearcey says that according to the data, true masculinity, which she argues is biblical masculinity, is what both Christian and non-Christian women say they want and what society desperately needs for men. Nancy Pearcey is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed by The Economist as, quote, America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Whether you're at the gym, on a flight, driving to an appointment, or just chilling out, this podcast is a resource to help men get to the next level. Welcome to the next stage.
Does your sermon only get one squeeze? There's probably more juice in that sermon. ReSermon repurposes sermon content for optimal ministry impact. Learn more at resermon.com or email hello@resermon.com.
So welcome to the Next Stage podcast. I got to tell you, I was on a flight to Europe. A friend had just handed me Nancy Pearcey's book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, and said, Rob, you've got to read this. I grabbed it. I devoured it in about 6 to 8 hours. And so excited to have Nancy Pearcey with us today. Welcome to the Next Stage. It's your first time here, hopefully not the last, but welcome to the show. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I love your work. Big fan, and our producer Chris introduced us, so I appreciate you jumping in. And I want to just jump right in to really what started this movement in your life. Nancy, what really first moved you to write The Toxic War on Masculinity? Was there a moment where you realized this message had to be told?
Actually, there was. The Washington Post had an article titled, Why Can't We Hate Men? And I thought, really, in a mainstream publication, I said, how has it become acceptable to express such hostility against men? And then, of course, I found lots of other examples. The Huffington Post editor tweeted, #KillAllMen, and then said it was a joke. And speaking of jokes, you can buy T-shirts that say, so many men, so little ammunition.
I've seen them.
And there are books with very blunt titles like I Hate Men or No Good Men. And there's one called Are Men Necessary? So, but the really tragic part is when men themselves jump on the bandwagon. There was a male author who wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then those are all in the book. And then there's one that came out after the book. You may have seen it. The director of the movie Avatar was in the news saying testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system.
I thought it was interesting. I've used this illustration in the podcast before. I said, yeah, this is from the guy who made almost $1 billion on movies that were all about testosterone, The Terminator and others, right?
Exactly.
So.
And so I thought, where's this coming from? I wanted to dig a little deeper because most of us think the concept that masculinity is toxic probably came out of the second wave feminism, 1960s. And it actually is much deeper. The roots go back much farther. And so to understand, social trend, you need to know where it came from and how it developed. And so that's what I try to do in this book, is to help Christians understand where is this coming from so that we can counter it more effectively.
Yeah, and you start the book off with your own personal story of how you walked into this. And I appreciate you sharing that point of vulnerability from the very beginning. It helped build a bridge of empathy for the reader. And so I appreciate that for sure.
Yeah, I decided to start with my own story in the introduction By the way, I have
Mhm.
people tell me, "Oh, I skip introductions."
Yeah,
So
don't. It's really
don't do
good.
that. No, yeah, I grew up in a severely abusive home. My father was abusive, and in books on abuse, they sometimes ask, "Was it open hand or closed fist?" And it was closed fist. It was
Mm.
punching. Um, his favorite was the knuckle fist, with the middle finger slightly extended to cause a sharper stab of pain. So when I became a young adult, not only did I give up my Christian faith, my Christian upbringing, but then I ricocheted off into extreme feminism. I read all the classic feminist books, and I thought they were wonderful. And I did have a lot of hostility and anger against men because of my father. And then I became a Christian and had to sort of rethink this whole question. And so I was interviewed by a Christian psychologist who said, "Well, at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. You're writing from the trenches." I really
Right.
had to work through this for many years. And, that deep of a abuse is not easily healed. So it's been many years of psychological, spiritual, and emotional healing. So that's where the book comes out of too, is that I really have personally had to wrestle with these ideas.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not just, yeah, like you said, ivory tower, but personal experience, and while painful, it's awesome to see you using that platform and that wound as a place of healing for others and as a point of your personal mission. That's incredible. So, in your research, I love this. And I've heard forever too, hey, the Christians, Christians are no different than non-Christians. And I love the way you shined a light on Brad Wilcox's research and finding that actually Christian men have the lowest rate of divorce and abuse and all of that. And that's shocking. What's the story behind that data, and kind of shed a light on that a little bit?
It was shocking to me too. You ask why I wrote the book. Well, you have to see a problem and you have to see a solution. So I saw the problem, but then I sort of stumbled on this data about Christian men, and I realized this is the solution. So the sort of media narrative is that Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity, right? That the assumption is if you believe in any sort of male headship in the home, that will turn you into an overbearing, tyrannical, oppressive patriarch. I'll give you just one example. I found plenty, but this was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So what happened is
Wow.
that's pretty strong. And the social scientists were listening, and they're saying, well, you're making these accusations, but where's your data? Where's your evidence? So the one good thing about Christian men being targeted is they got studied. And so in my book, I give about a dozen studies. And exactly, well, let me break it down. First of all, the wives interviewed, by the way, yes, they're interviewed separately. I always get asked that.
Right. They weren't coerced into, yeah, which is such the media paradigm that we've
It is.
seen. It's like, we'll get into where that came from in a minute, but please
Yeah, she
continue.
said she
Sorry
was
to
happy
interrupt.
because her husband's sitting right there. What can she
Yeah,
say?
right, right.
So clarify. No, the wives were interviewed separately, and so the wives of evangelical men report the highest level of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. Evangelical fathers spend 3.5 hours per week more with their children than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And then the real surprise is that they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. And you mentioned Brad Wilcox. So he did the largest study. He's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times. So in a New York Times article, sometimes a quote can help crystallize it. Here's what he said. It turns out, direct quote, turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. So this is solid empirical research. It's not, a pep talk from a religious leader. It's carefully tested, researched facts that show that evangelical Christian men actually test out better than any other group, the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So I was surprised, given my background with my father. I did not expect this. So I was really happy to be able to put that into the book. And you probably are the type who reads footnotes. And if you did, you probably noticed that all my footnotes are to academic journal articles. This material is not out in the public yet, and it's not out in the churches yet. So I would hope that my book helps get pastors to be more encouraging, more affirming to the men who are actually doing quite well. But, God's design does work, and the men who follow it are doing much better.
I mean, there's a loneliness and isolation epidemic going on in our world today. 50% of men report frequent feelings of loneliness. Another 50% report not having any close friends, and 70% of men report not having a significant relationship or a conversation that goes beyond the surface level in the last week. Life doesn't have to be that way. In fact, Sherpa Unlimited has come along and said, we want to help solve that problem. And I want you to picture your world like this. Picture your world where you have other strong men around you who are heading the same direction you are. Not just yes men in your life or drinking buddies or poker playing buddies or something like that, but men where you had the opportunity to grow, to really foster the kind of life that you want, to grow that internal world that allows you to be the man you need to be at work, at home, in your community. Men who are there to challenge you, but also lift you up when you fall. And we all do. I want you to check out Sherpa Unlimited's opportunity that we have coming up. They're called Ascent Men's Communities. These are bi-weekly groups that meet literally anywhere in the world. You have to invest in these. They're not just free, but it's very affordable. You'll see. Less than the cost of a couple pizzas, and certainly less than the cost of your gym membership. Go to sherpaunlimited.com/ascent. We'll see you in one of our Ascent Men's Communities very soon.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I've been an ambassador for your book to other men's ministry leaders around the country, saying you've got to read this. I mean, in really the top half of that demographic, as Wilcox separates out the bottom and the top half of that demographic, the bottom half, I say, you know what? It seems like those men have just enough religion to make them worse than the rest of society. On the other hand, men who are walking with God, and granted, I could sit in a pew every week and not be a believer. I get that. But the conscious effort to have those disciplines in place, there is a substantial, abundant life that's there. And so thank you for, number one, finding the research, him doing it, which was not recently, it was years ago. But yeah, thank you for your work on that. It's incredible.
And like I said, it's about a dozen. So it's not just one researcher. He just did the largest study. But the first pushback I always get is about what you just called the bottom half.
The nominal believer, yeah.
Because people say, well, wait a minute, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? So what people like Brad Wilcox and these other researchers did is they went back to the data and they made that very important distinction that you just mentioned. The committed, authentic Christian men versus the nominals. And by the way, my students don't even know what nominal means, so I have to tell them.
It's useful. I mean, it separates. Yeah, there's some kind of differentiation there, and for real.
Well, the name. Well, yeah. You know how they've differentiated them. Well, first of all, nominal, NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only.
Name only.
But the way they differentiated it in the studies was just how often you go to church. Are you a regular churchgoer? It turned out that correlated very well with how committed men really were. And the nominal men test out dramatically differently. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They divorced at a higher rate than even secular couples, 20% higher. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. So to quote another Brad Wilcox article, this was in Christianity Today, And he said, the most violent husbands in America, with the italicized, the most violent husbands in America are evangelical Protestant men who attend church rarely, if at all. So that's what we're up against, like in churches and men's ministries, like yours, is on the one hand, how can you affirm and support the men who are doing a good job? And on the other hand, how can you reach out to these nominals who, like you say, are hanging around the edges of the Christian world enough to pick up language like headship and submission, but they don't get the biblical meaning, right? So they're infusing those words with meaning from the secular world. And how in the world do we reach out and disciple these men, I think is a real challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And having spent so much time in the corporate world, I mean, I haven't exactly hung around Christian men my whole life. And so have wrestled with that, have been trying to be salt and light in that environment. And so, I love that. And I love the heart behind let's go reach everyone. And by the way, shine a light on this really, really good news instead of being weighed down with so much criticism all the time.
Oh, yeah. I have a graduate student who was the head of the women's ministry at a very large megachurch here in Houston. And she said, here's her anecdote. On Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better.
Right.
I was very careful not to have a scolding tone in this book. That is not what works. Like you said, let's bring this positive data from the social scientists and help. Men don't respond well to being called toxic. Nobody would. So we can bring this positive data instead. And in fact, it's not just Christians. There was the first ever cross-cultural study done by an anthropologist, cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity, not of men, but of ideals of what it meant to be a man. And surprisingly, he found that cultures are all different, of course, but they all had a common core of what they thought it meant to be a good man. And he summarized it as the anthropologist summarized it as the 3 Ps. The good man is the one who will provide, protect, and procreate, meaning become a father, build into the next generation. And he found that this was across the entire globe, not just countries with a Christian background. But what that tells us is that men are made in God's image, and they do have an inherent, innate sense of what it means to be a good man, that there are unique masculine strengths and not given them to get whatever they want, but to provide, protect, to care for those that they love. I found that very encouraging, that seems to be intrinsic to all men everywhere, just because they're made in God's image.
It's eternity in their hearts. I mean, It's like we have been made in the image of God, and a walk with Him leads to those things. You do. I love the contrast in the book too between the real man and the good man. Could you separate that a little bit, or walk us into that?
Yeah, so that was another study. And by the way, I put it at the front of the book because this book has been the most controversial book I've written, which surprised me. I didn't expect that. But I think before we went on air, we were talking about an example from the book. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." So I thought, okay, let me put this study right at the beginning of the book. And it was by a sociologist who, again, is so well known that he speaks all around the world. And so he came up with a very clever experiment where he would ask young men 2 questions. First, he would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're in a funeral and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And he said all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing things like duty, honor, sacrifice, responsibility, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And he would say, well, where'd you learn that? And the young men would say, I don't know. In other words, it really is just God's image in them. They intrinsically know this. And then he would follow up, though, with a second question. And he would say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain. What else? Get rich and get laid. I'm using their language there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's this path of money and sex and power and all of that. Yeah, absolutely.
And so the sociologists concluded that men are sort of trapped in the pressure between these two contrasting scripts, that they do inherently know what it means to be the good man because they're made in God's image, but they also feel cultural pressure in most cultures to live up to the real man. Well, and by the way, of course, those aren't all bad. Being tough, we want people to hang tough in a crisis. But if it gets separated from a moral vision, then it can slide into, like you just said, power, sex, money, control, and dominance, and entitlement. And so it was fascinating. He helped analyze why. When I write a book, I always have lots of reading groups to get feedback and rub off the rough edges. And when my reading groups would tell their family and friends they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first response was, "Whose side is she on?"
Right.
You have to be on a side.
Possibly be objective or intelligent. She's got to be some type of on one of the poles, right?
That's the word I use too. I said,
she's
can I be
objective? One way or the other.
And they actually, most men assumed that a woman writing a book on the subject would be a male bashing feminist. And then there was sort of the red pill side, where they thought, well, if she's defending men, she's some sort of red pill reactionary, manosphere type. And so that's really why I put that study at the beginning of the book, because you don't have to be on one side. You can affirm what's good. God-given masculinity is good. And you can still think critically about the secular cultural scripts that we have. And that putting that right at the beginning of the book sort of diffused that, that sense of defensiveness or suspicion that so many people come to the book with.
Mm-hmm. I got to admit, I picked the book up and I was like, oh boy, here comes either a beating, which I don't need. I've had it. I'm aware of my own tendencies in my own life. And I think most men are. But on the other hand, man, I want something that's more critically thinking. And so that's what I appreciate. It's so well documented. That's why I tell people, read this book. It is so well documented. I love it. So thank you. I want to shift us, if I can, to just talk about how we got here in the U.S. And one of the neat things through the book was really you tracing history from the colonial era to the Industrial Revolution, Darwinian theory, and even postmodern secularism. How did these, if we can do this in a couple minutes, rewrite and shape the script of masculinity, specifically in the United States?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that surprised me as I started my research, is you had to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, most men worked with their family all day, their wives and children, on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role. That you have to be gentle and patient with your children if you're going to be working alongside them. And they're people you love. In fact, even secular historians will say this. This was one historian put it this way. The colonial concept of masculine virtue was, quote, duty to God and man. Oh, it sounds so wonderful. And how did we lose that concept of masculine virtue? Well, it really does start when the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. Of course, men had to follow their work into offices and factories. And for the first time in American history, men were not working with people they loved and had a moral bond with throughout the day. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's a very different work environment. And that's when you actually start to see the literature change. You already back then in the 19th century, you see people saying men are losing that caretaking ethos. They're becoming egocentric, self-centered, greedy, and acquisitive, to use the 19th century language, and turning their career into an idol. Instead of getting their identity from their family and church, they're getting their identity now from the workplace. And fathers being out of the home as well. We're so used to it. that we don't know that if you read the literature, it was experienced as traumatic for men to be gone from their family all day. And so that's where we also get the notion, the idea that fathers are incompetent and the bumbling idiot, in cartoons and in media, in advertisements, the father's always the butt of the joke. You already see that in the 19th century because men are no longer with their children all day. So they don't know the children's needs. They don't know what their children are experiencing. And you begin to see them described as incompetent and superfluous as parents. So it has really deep roots, and most of it is the Industrial Revolution, which changed the script for masculinity and especially for fathers. Of course, that does give you some sense of the solution has to be somehow reconnecting men with their families again.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. My wife and I were watching a show the other night, and it was cast, and there was a woman who didn't get the promotion. They were talking about another captain. I go, "This is going to be a white male. Just watch." And it was. And she goes, "How'd you know?" I go, "There is never in the media a man who is smart, compassionate, strong, gentle, all at the same time. There's never that. It's always Homer Simpson or some ogre, oppressive type of a villain." And I'm like, man, how did that shape in our culture? Like it seemed to come out of exactly what you're saying around that Industrial Revolution time when that man was taken out of the home and then forward, painted as he's aloof, and he's tired. He's separated.
Yeah, when
right?
he comes home, his time is his own. So he comes across as selfish and isolated. But you mentioned Darwinism too. In my book, I go through several stages of how the secular script for masculinity developed. But my favorite one is Darwinism because most people are surprised by that. They think Darwinism is about biology. But the social Darwinists immediately began drawing the connection to masculinity. They began to say things like, the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be the ones who were brutal, ruthless, competitive, and predatory. And barbarian, that was another word they used a lot in the 19th century, barbarian. And so instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, they would urge men to live down to what they called the beast within. That the true masculine identity was, not the spiritual identity, but merely this sort of animalistic, biological urges, instincts. And the thing is that's still around. Let me pull out a quote because I want to make sure I get this one right. Social Darwinism isn't called that anymore because it got discredited. So they have a new name for it. It's called evolutionary psychology. But the books from that perspective have the same message. Let me give you an example from a book called The Moral Animal, a best-selling book. So that tells you a lot of people are reading this. And the author says, human males are by nature oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pigs. Giving them advice on successful marriage is like offering Vikings a free booklet titled How Not to Pillage. And I'm glad he has a sense of humor, but I thought, how does he get away with such a negative view of men? And then another book, it's an older book that was just reissued called Of Men and Marriage. And the author there says, men are by nature violent, sexually predatory, and irresponsible. Their deepest yearning is not for wife and family, but for the motorbike and the open road. The male group escape to primal mode of predatory and immediate gratification. And I thought, so this is the masculine script in the secular world. Now you understand where the Andrew Tate phenomenon comes from? Right. It has deep intellectual roots. It seemed to just show up out of nowhere. But now we know that the secular script has been developing, for a century or two. And it's very important for Christians to learn how to counter it. Another one of my graduate students now teaches high school. And she wrote me an email and she said, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school.
Right.
So if we're not helping young people, young men in particular, with a strong, healthy, positive biblical sense of masculinity, they're going to be drawn into the secular orbit of people like Andrew Tate. So that is another reason we need organizations like yours helping young people in particular.
Well, it is amazing to me. I've seen, being a Gen Xer, right? And we have our own issues, so I'm not beating up on every other generation, but the millennials, especially the Gen Zs, a lack of, like your student said, it's been beaten out of us. Like there's been very little, like with gentle parenting, there's, it's all about feelings. It's all about that. And that is very important. And I'm a feeler myself, so I get deep feeling. But there doesn't seem to be really hands-on good modeling from safe, strong, engaged dads in homes, and especially among populations where you've got such a huge divorce rate and a huge percent of single moms. It's no wonder, number one, compassion for a single mom who has to shoulder the whole load of her family. That's unimaginable to me, to have that kind of weight on you. Mm-hmm. But you can't instill what you don't, you can't impart what you don't possess. A strong sense of masculinity and a strong sense of manhood. So it's no wonder that there's generations, literally two now, that are like, what do we do? Where do we go?
Yeah, it was really heart-wrenching when I read an article by a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, I'm seeing, especially among young men who are coming into my practice, feeling depressed and demoralized, beaten down, because they do feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. And so, and you mentioned fatherless children too. I also quote a doctor who said, most of the people coming into my practice and asking for psychotropic drugs for their kids, for ADHD and so on, are single moms. The vast majority who come in looking for drugs to help their kids calm down are single mothers. And he said, I interpret it as the child's cry for, I need my daddy. That's how he put it. When they are acting out to the point where the mother says, I can't do this anymore, I need a drug, it's, I need my daddy. So and the positive side, let me give you the positive side. That's always leave people with hope. One of the largest studies ever done on how parents can successfully pass along their religious convictions was a 35-year longitudinal study, won all kinds of awards because it was so well done. And the study found two surprising things. One is fathers matter more than mothers in passing on their spiritual convictions. I mean, mothers pass on, they have an impact, but fathers, have a measurably higher impact than mothers do. By the way, when I tell my students this, the female students say, well, that's not fair. And I say, well, it's a fact. You can't argue with it.
Facts aren't always fair.
But the second thing they found out was it's the quality of the relationship with the father that counts. If the father is, a pillar of the church, a moral exemplar, has perfect theology, but the child perceives him as cold, distant, and authoritarian, they will not follow him in his faith. They will not follow his religious convictions. So it's father matters more, but it has to be a warm, loving, supportive, close relationship. And the interesting thing is even secular people are finding something similar. There was a whole study done. It fills a whole book on how to raise masculine boys. And they found the same thing. They found that it doesn't matter whether the father is stereotypically masculine or not, whether he's the John Wayne type. What matters is his warm, close, loving relationship with his son. And if he has that, the son will come out with a healthy, strong sense of masculinity. So both the secular and the religious publications, the studies are finding the same thing. The quality of the relationship with the father is the most important thing for both religion and for having a strong sense of masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm a girl dad. I have 3 daughters, and and a very, very strong wife who's not a pushover by any means. And I'll tell you what, the thing that I found as a man, the best thing I could do, and I was told this very early on, encourage, hug, be physical with your children, because that passes on a sense of identity, a sense of strength, be it for boys or girls. And being there is, I tell men, showing up is 80%. You know.
And what's people always ask me too, well, practically speaking, what can we do? You can't reverse the Industrial Revolution. How can we connect men, with their families more? Well, the pandemic opened a lot of people's eyes to the fact that we can tweak the workplace some. Um, Harvard University, this is again not in the book because it's so recent. Harvard University did a study, and their conclusion was this: during the pandemic, 68% of fathers said they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. So men are now saying, I would like to have at least maybe a hybrid position that allowed me more time at home, a flexible hours, more job sharing. Men are typically more concerned about asking for it because they don't want to appear uncommitted to the job. Right. But I also found several quotes from CEOs, because you have to persuade the corporations too that this is going to be good for them. And I found several quotes. And they're in one of the last chapters in my book. I quoted several CEOs who said things like, well, here's what one said: before the pandemic, we were really suspicious of any kind of home-based work, remote work, and so on. And then he said, during the pandemic, that fear was completely exploded. We did not see any drop in productivity. In fact, if anything, people who are not wasting time commuting have more time to work. I interviewed, you have to have anecdotes too. Sometimes you just have to have stories of how people did it. So one of my graduate students was married to a IT professional who came home during the pandemic. So I interviewed him, and he said, yeah, because I was home. Well, first of all, I didn't miss a beat on the job. I mean, Zoom meetings and all, you don't miss anything by working from home. And then he said, because I was home, I was able to be more involved with our family's homeschooling. I decided I would be the parent who made lunch. I could take my kids to soccer. And then the final thing he said is, the time I used to spend commuting to work, I now spend praying with my wife every morning. So we need anecdotes like that to help people realize you can, in fact, tweak the workplace to allow fathers more time with their children. And when fathers are given anonymous surveys, they often say, I quoted, again, this is in the book, I quoted a survey where like 70% of fathers said, given a choice between a raise and more flexible time for family, the men would say flexible time with family. Mm-hmm. So men actually do want to be involved fathers. They just don't feel that culture supports them.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So in your opinion, and this could be research-based or just your own personal observation and encouragement, what can churches and organizations like Sherpa Unlimited and a number of other men's organizations do to better call men up, encourage men, equip men, instead of just calling them out and beating them down, right? Mm-hmm. What can we do?
Well, first of all, churches need to have men's groups. When I started this book, I assumed that they all did because they all have women's groups. Mm-hmm. So I was surprised to find out most churches don't. So we have to start by having men's groups. And then the second thing is, like you said, when you first saw the book, you just assumed that it would probably be that scolding tone. We need to bring into the churches the social science data. I spoke at a men's group not long ago, and I had a handful of men all come up to me afterwards and say, you gave us facts. We love this. You actually gave us facts. Because they expect it to be a sort of devotional, a tug at your emotions. even if it's positive, it's going to be more more of a emotional approach.
Mm-hmm.
And men do like facts. They do like actual data, and now we have it. So I would suggest, we need to present the material in a way that many men are oriented, which is towards achievement, success, facts, data. There was a study done by David Murrow. David Murrow wrote the book "Why Men Hate Going to Church." Are you familiar with that book?
Yes, I am.
And he talks about a little survey he did, in which he took a list of adjectives and he took 2 lists, and then he asked several churches, because he speaks a lot, so he would try this on several churches, which group of adjectives describes more Jesus and his followers. And what he didn't tell them is he took the 2 lists from the book Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus.
Right.
And invariably, the churches would choose the women are from Venus adjectives, like nurturing and love and compassion and connection. And they would not choose the more masculine stereotypes like competence, achievement, accomplishment, rationality, problem solver. They wouldn't choose those. So I think we have a task here. How can we make our messages appeal to the masculine character? I mean, we have to be very, very convinced that masculinity is good. God created it. By the way, another question I always get with this book is, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women then? And I say, well, just start with physical. Those are huge. Men are bigger, faster, stronger, 75% more upper body muscle mass, 90% greater upper body strength. And because of testosterone, they are on average more aggressive and more risk-taking. And we have to treat this like the creational givens. This is how God made man, and we have to make sure that we're affirming these things as good. They're not hearing that message from the culture. They have to get it in the church. Because the church often gives people the impression, well, like that survey that David Murrow did, that we're asking you to be more like women. We want you to fit this list of female adjectives. The church often tends to give that impression. So I think we need to start by saying, what are the masculine traits that are part of just the way God created men? It's the software and the virus. The software is how God created men, and the virus is the sin. And so we need to find out what the software is and make sure that we're affirming and supporting and encouraging men, that these are all good qualities. No matter what the culture is saying, God has created men, and these are all good, and they're good for women. If men are strong,
right? These are not gender specific, right?
Oh, I meant when men are men, it's good for women.
It's good for women, but so is messages of compassion for men and strength for women. Those are not gender exclusive necessarily.
Exactly.
So
but
that's great.
Still, the fact is that a lot of men, at least this is what I hear, feel like the church is telling them to be holy, to be godly, is to be more like women. And so I think we need to counter that message. I mean, the feminist movement has done a lot to say to women, it's okay for you to be strong. It's okay for you to be leaders. Women hear that. And that's why, in fact, look at how men are falling behind in education. All the way down to kindergarten, boys are falling behind. All the way up through high school, boys are falling behind, both test scores and grades. What was the stat? Well, there's books coming out with titles like The Problem with Boys, Why Boys Fail, The War Against Boys, The Trouble with Boys. There are books coming out trying to deal with the fact that boys are falling behind. And then in college, again, this was new to me when I wrote the book, 60% of college students are female, 40% are male. And in small Christian colleges, like where I teach, Houston Christian University, when I came here, we were 70-30. So, by the way, and we have consciously tried to overcome that by 2 things: starting a football team and starting an engineering school, because we are trying to consciously bring more men in. And then, of course, once they get out of school, men are falling behind. Men are more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, homeless, have mental illness, and these days, even unemployment. It's they don't call it unemployment because it doesn't show up in the unemployment statistics. If you're not looking for work, you don't show up.
Right.
So they had to dig deeper. And now researchers tell us that male workforce participation, that's what they call it, is
Right.
at
The
great
workforce participation rate.
workforce,
Yep.
yeah, is at Great Depression era levels. At Great Depression era levels, we remember what a crisis that was.
Mhm.
So, and then even life expectancy has gone down. Women's has stayed the same, but male life expectancy has gone down in recent years. And so there was a Science magazine that had an article on it, and it said the greatest demographic factor now in early death is being male. So I think it's time for us to say we do need special programs to encourage men. We need to have compassion for men. I mean, the reason girls got ahead in school was not because they're smarter. I don't think they're smarter. I think we're all made in God's image. But because we've poured millions of dollars into promoting programs for girls, 1972, Title IX, and so on, the Gender Equity Act, 1994, poured millions of dollars into curriculum for girls that would encourage girls, and workshops and trainings and so on. And see, the idea was that they would bring girls up to where boys were. They had no idea that girls would shoot right past. But that's
Right.
what's happened. Girls have shot right past them now. But
Right.
why? Because we did have special programs. Isn't it time we had some special programs for boys that would encourage them in their unique learning styles and their unique personality traits? I think it's time for us to have special programs for men and boys.
Absolutely. And even educationally, my wife's a second grade teacher, and she's like, hey, these boys are not going to behave well and become girls. Their attention spans, I mean, her room moves about every 2 minutes physically, because she's like, they've got to move. And so to have an educational system that's trained around, come sit down, be in the circle, they need to wrestle. They need to, they're like little bear cubs all over each other. And it's what happens.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And when schools get rid of recess, it's a catastrophe.
Yeah. So much to talk about. I could talk with you for hours, and I'm gonna pick up your next book, by the way. Well, I'm gonna pick up a previous book, Love Thy Body,
Oh yeah.
because in Colorado, this transgender issue is so huge. We just passed a law. If you misgender your child, you can go to jail.
Yes.
I want to jump into that with you. I want to read this book and then have you back on the show. But
Excellent.
wow.
Because again, I mean, my background is apologetics, so my goal is to explain the secular world. So
Mhm.
I don't just I have scripture and the Christian view of sexuality,
Sure.
but you get that from other writers. What's unique about Love Thy Body is I analyze the non-Christian perspective on sexuality. So the secular worldview that drives the things like the transgender issue, the transgender ideology. So yeah, I would love to talk to you about that. And I did
That's
see the
great.
news about Colorado. Yes, you can.
Oh yeah. Live
Yes.
right in the middle of it. And people are like, you can't be a Christian in Colorado. I go, we're salt and light. What are you talking about? You got to be salt and you got to be light. So we're jumping into that arena. And I'll tell you what, Nancy, where can people find a copy of your book, Toxic War on Masculinity?
Well, you can find it anywhere, Amazon, of course. But you can also come to my website, nancypearcey.com. And Pearcey is Pearcey, nancypearcey.com. So there you can browse my other books, like the one that you just mentioned, Love Thy Body. And you can drop a note and say hello, which is really fun. I appreciate when people do that. But of course, my books are at any Christian bookstore, of course, Amazon.
Yeah. Lots of
they're easy to find.
We just kind of scratched the surface on one of these books, but yeah, if you could speak, just kind of wrapping us up, just one sentence to men today, what would you say? Men who are leaning into this kind of work, what would you say? What encouragement would you give them?
I would go back to saying it's the facts. The facts show that if you follow God's design, you will have a happier marriage and healthier family. And I think it's so amazing that the scientific studies back up scripture. This people think science and scripture are opposites and in conflict with one another. And this is one area where the scientific data has clearly backed up the Christian view of masculinity, of marriage and family.
Mm. Yeah, God's way is not only true and right, but it works. It is the abundant life, and not to throw like a scripture gloss on the end of this, but it really is. When God says, "Love me with your heart, soul, mind, and strength," and this is good things happen in your life. So yeah, I want to thank you for jumping in here, being part of the show, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was wonderful talking with you.
Does your sermon only get one squeeze? There's probably more juice in that sermon. ReSermon repurposes sermon content for optimal ministry impact. Learn more at resermon.com or email hello@resermon.com.
Men, there's a loneliness and isolation epidemic going on in our world today. 50% of men report frequent feelings of loneliness. Another 50% report not having any close friends. And 70% of men report not having a significant relationship or a conversation that goes beyond the surface level in the last week. Life doesn't have to be that way. In fact, Sherpa Unlimited has come along and said, we want to help solve that problem. And I want you to picture your world like this. Picture your world where you have other strong men around you who are heading the same direction you are. Not just yes men in your life or drinking buddies or poker playing buddies or something like that, but men where you had the opportunity to grow, to really foster the kind of life that you want, to grow that internal world that allows you to be the man you need to be at work, at home, in your community. Men who were there to challenge you, but also lift you up when you fall. And we all do. I want you to check out Sherpa Unlimited's opportunity that we have coming up. They're called Ascent Men's Communities. These are bi-weekly groups that meet literally anywhere in the world. You have to invest in these. They're not just free, but it's very affordable. You'll see. Less than the cost of a couple pizzas and certainly less than the cost of your gym membership. Go to sherpaunlimited.com/ascent. We'll see you in one of our Ascent Men's communities very soon.
Thanks for joining us for the Next Stage podcast with Rob Stout. The Next Stage is a production of Sherpa Unlimited executive and personal life coaching for men, based in Denver, Colorado. Learn more at sherpaunlimited.com/thenextstage or visit Sherpa's communities on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. For questions, comments, or feedback, email us at thenextstage@sherpaunlimited.com. The Next Stage distributes episodes every 2 weeks on Wednesday mornings. The Next Stage helps men built in God's image live their life with passion, power, purpose, and perspective. And the key to doing this is by exploring the ancient wisdom found in the Holy Scriptures. If you don't have a copy of the Bible, you can visit any public library and check one out. Or just download a free online Bible app called YouVersion for your smartphone. Go to your smartphone's app store and search YOUVersion and select the YouVersion Bible. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.